a vital lifeline, buried in the barren desert of California.
That canyon is kind of landslide ready. It's not solid ground, it's kind of shattered granite.
And once the slide starts, it just keeps sliding until there's nothing left.
A hulking remnant of the Cold War, rusting away behind the Iron Curtain.
It's such an impressive sight. There's this enormous structure in front of you that looks so complex.
A massive Nazi complex built for brainwashing.
Is nothing but a modern-day mind control center.
Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet. At the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. Who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? High in the mountains of Southern California, close to the Mexican border, stands one of the most daring and dangerous engineering projects ever undertaken. The huge structure dominates the empty, barren landscape around it. But this is no ordinary bridge. This is the largest curved wooden structure on Earth.
An impressive sight. There's this enormous structure in front of you that looks so complex. It feels like something that has been artificially built to make it look that way. And it screams kind of the Wild West and, you know, frontier America. But it's absolutely genuine. This is exactly how it was. And it's been untouched because it's in the middle of nowhere.
This abandoned bridge links two Rocky Mountain peaks. It stands 200 feet above the ground, is 600 feet long, and has an impressive 14-degree curve. But why would anyone build such a huge bridge in this remote, hostile environment? And why was it abandoned? In the early 20th century, the American railroad is in its golden age. In the American West, the government desperately needs to connect two vital centers of trade and population, San Diego and Arizona. But how do they get a line through a wide, gaping canyon in the remote desert wilderness? The solution is this: the Goat Canyon Trestle Bridge.
The Goat Canyon Trestle is an amazing engineering feat. The question is, was it really necessary, or was it a product of its time, which was all about, wow, it's impossible to get from here to there, but we can do it.
A small army of workers and engineers begin building in 1932. Conditions are brutal. No water for miles or protection from the relentless desert sun.
Building the Goat Canyon Trestle must have been an absolute nightmare. Just look at where it is. It's in the middle of the desert. You've got a lack of water, extreme temperatures. You're building the whole thing out of timber, which is going to be extremely dry out there. The smallest spark or a cigarette casually thrown away could set the whole thing alight. It's absolutely treacherous working conditions.
But what other dangers do the engineers face? And using what is essentially 19th century technology, just how difficult is the trestle bridge to build?
That entire stretch of the San Diego and Arizona line, built along the side of the canyon with the trestles, the tunnels, but also following the contours of the canyon, that canyon is kind of landslide ready. It's not solid ground, it's kind of shattered granite that they're building this on top of. To be there, working on that, knowing that the land could go away beneath your feet at any time, not only would have been completely petrifying, but to achieve what they did and to have built that whole stretch of line, it's unbelievable.
The railway aims to connect San Diego with Arizona and runs through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the world. At the time, the building project is dubbed the Impossible Railroad.
There were all sorts of problems building the railway so close to the Mexican border. I mean, there was incident after incident, kidnaps, murders.
But it's not just violence, falling rocks, and extreme heat that affects the bridge's construction. The very geology proves extremely challenging.
The railroad was plagued with issues, but a large portion is primarily within this region because it's so unstable. Some of these mountains are solid rock, some of them are a combination of decomposed granite, and once the slide starts, it just keeps sliding until there's nothing left.
The Goat Canyon Trestle isn't the first attempt to get trains over this canyon. Engineers first built a railway tunnel in the early 1900s, but that collapses after just 1 year. Then they even construct rail tracks on the canyon edge, but those slide down the mountain.
To my left is the collapsed Tunnel 15. There's a massive slide area up on the hillside. Shoved it down about 18, 19 feet.
The problem they faced was how to repair the vital rail line connecting San Diego to the rest of the USA. The answer, a giant trestle bridge, and the clock was ticking. The engineering behind the structure may appear very simple, but it's made up of a vast number of short spans supported by a tripod, onto which the bridge platform is then laid.
This all started with one man, John D. Spreckles. He felt that it was important for San Diego to have a transcontinental link to the eastern part of the United States. And he believed that he could promote San Diego and its beautiful natural harbor for business and growing the city itself.
His whole ethos was that if you want people to live somewhere, you have to give them a form of transportation. It has to be comfortable, and most important of all, it has to be cheap.
But the construction project is plagued with delays and problems, given the huge difficulty of the task and its location. And one element alone makes this bridge stand out from its competitors and adds greatly to the risks involved. It's made entirely out of wood.
Timber structures like the Goat Canyon Trestle are designed to be quite flexible. If you were to watch a great big train rumble across the top, you would see flexibility and movement in all of the members, in all of the trestles and the ties. They would be moving. It was designed to do that. It's part of the beauty. As they all move, the stresses are kind of relieved and not all taken in by one point. Some of those timbers are drying out faster than others, means that that flexibility is now possibly part of the reason why it's coming apart. The timber itself is still great. It's just the bolts that are holding it together have been loosened by all of that movement and flexibility. And if no one's going along to tighten them up anymore, you're going to get a structure that's no longer sound.
Though it's crucial for the structural support, the wood does have a potentially fatal flaw.
Because it's on a grade, a 1.6% grade, the problem comes from the brake shoe. Happen to apply the brakes for long distances, it would heat up and hot pieces of metal would come off and could fall down into the superstructure and substructure of the trestle.
This spear of hot shards of metal falling from the brakes into the wood structure and starting a fire is a very real and ever-present threat. A threat so serious that a huge water tank is installed on the mountainside to supply a trackside sprinkler system.
There's a tank car that sits above this Goat Creek Canyon. trestle that they installed there with the piping specifically to suppress any fire that would burn their $300,000 project.
And then they would have a person tend that so that when the trains would travel over the bridge, he would turn on the valves and come out and start the sprinklers and stuff just to make sure none of the hot pieces of metal off the brake shoe were able to catch it on fire. But without that, it would have been at great risk.
Will the Goat Canyon Trestle Bridge work as planned? And why was it abandoned? After 11 years of meticulous and dangerous engineering efforts, John D. Spreckles and his engineering team complete the Goat Canyon Trestle Bridge. Instantly, it becomes the highest and most remote wooden railway structure ever built. Standing over 200 feet above the dusty desert floor, it spans 750 feet across the uninhabited canyon, Carrizo Gorge. Known as the Impossible Railroad, conditions on board the train live up to this moniker.
San Diego, Arizona was known as kind of derogatorily as the slow, dirty, and aggravating. There was no air conditioning in the cars. There were no screens on the windows. They were running steam locomotives. They would go through these tunnels and they would be choked out by the steam and the fumes, and they'd have to close the windows and it'd be 100 degrees. So I don't think it was a very good ride.
The most dangerous element of the bridge's construction is its 14-degree curve. This is essential to maximize the strength of the bridge. A straight, non-curved angle makes the whole structure more vulnerable to strong winds and collapse. But if the train goes too fast, it could derail and end up plunging to the desert floor below, as this footage from another trestle bridge in the 1970s shows.
The speed on this bridge, because of the 14-degree curve on it, is about 10 miles an hour. In real terms, that's a very sharp curve. It's very difficult to maintain that. It's also very destructive to the structure.
In 1976, Hurricane Kathleen hits other bridges on the rail line, and after several earthquakes, rock falls, fires, and the rise of car travel, the trestle bridge is finally abandoned in that same year. Today, the barren mountains surrounding Goat Canyon Trestle obscure it from all but the most determined travelers. 6,000 miles away on the other side of the planet in Ukraine, inside the notorious Chernobyl exclusion zone, is the site of one of the most extraordinary structures ever built. Looming over the landscape is a giant latticework of beams and cables. Towering over 500 feet and spanning 2,500 feet long, this once top-secret complex is, for all intents and purposes, in the middle of nowhere. Today, it stands dead and silent, except for the creaking of its steel plates in the wind. But once, this incredible machine could be heard around the world.
Wow, this is post-apocalyptic. This is a movie set. I could see James Bond. I could see Bruce Willis. It's that kind of eerie silence today that makes you think this could make a great film from an abandoned civilization on Mars. It's just that weird.
But what does this massive structure have to do with Chernobyl? And why was it abandoned? In the 70s, Cold War tensions are mounting. The Soviet Union is looking to boost its military technology against the West. To do this, they construct the massive Duga woodpecker.
If you look at it, you can't help but be awestruck and recognize it immediately as being Soviet. as being an icon of the Cold War. Did they have something that looked intimidating, that might give the impression of technological advancement? Yes, right. Build it, and build it big.
The Duga woodpecker is, in fact, an over-the-horizon radar. But how does this radar actually work?
The over-the-horizon radar will give you an ability to scan an area literally thousands of kilometers range. This, of course, is essential if you are going to provide that early warning against another country's aircraft or missiles.
The thing you have to remember is, obviously, the Earth is curved, okay? So that sort of limits the distance that any wave that the radar might be giving out can travel to the horizon. If you want to see things that are further away, you need to be able to make the wave sort of bend or go around with the curvature of the Earth. And one of the ways you can do that is, thankfully, we have this ionosphere, which, with these sort of low frequencies that we're talking about with radar, they can't go through, so they literally just bounce. So you can actually utilize that to try and get your waves to travel further and then back again.
And the only way to make this work is to build big. Really big.
To bounce those signals off the ionosphere and down, and of course to get the return off the ionosphere, you need a massive sender and you need a massive receiver. Even the most sophisticated modern over-the-horizon radar apparatus, you can't miniaturize these things. They are vast installations.
With its ability to detect incoming missiles, the Duga woodpecker would be in the front line of any future war. But will it work?
Since 1970, the Soviets have invested $500 billion more on their military forces than we have. Can anyone still doubt their single-minded determination to expand their power?
3, 2, 1, 0.
With the flight time of nuclear missiles measured in just minutes, accurate assessment of incoming signals is a matter of life and death. One false reading could mean disaster.
The woodpecker is testament to the fact that big does not mean better. It has the computer processing power of any computer in the 1970s. It's minuscule. What this means is that the results have to be interpreted by an individual who is, well, it's a human for a start, and if they get it wrong, if they think that maybe this is an incoming missile and not a bird, which has caused this fluctuation, then guess what? It's the start of World War III.
With its powerful radar signal traversing the globe, could the Duga woodpecker have played a role in the Chernobyl nuclear disaster? The so-called Duga woodpecker in Ukraine is a massive over-the-horizon radar from the Cold War. Like all such Soviet installations, its operation is shrouded in secrecy. Built in 1976, the Soviets tried to operate the radar in secret for 12 years. But it has one dead giveaway. When in operation, it gives off a distinct tapping noise, which can easily be heard by anyone listening in. This is how the radar earned its nickname, the woodpecker.
Radar signals themselves tended to jam and interrupt all kinds of standard civilian frequencies, including airliner radio frequencies. They later had to change some frequencies there because there were so many international complaints.
Another problem is its location. It's situated just 7 miles from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which provided the massive amounts of electricity used to power the radar.
The woodpecker was constructed in the 1970s, but it was still up and running in the 1980s, leading some to speculate that the power that it was drawing in and the signals it was producing may have caused the Chernobyl power plant to explode.
The the Duga woodpecker sent out powerful magnetron high-frequency radio waves. As Chernobyl was just 7 miles away, some experts believe that they might have interfered with some of the controls at the nuclear power plant, and might even have been responsible for the meltdown that occurred.
Whether this is true or not remains a matter of speculation.
When reactor number 4 at the plant explodes on April 26, 1986, a huge area is exposed to radioactive contamination.
Reactor number 4 exploded, spewing radiation over much of Europe. 2 others have been permanently shut down. It is the world's worst nuclear accident.
Overnight, the entire Duga complex and the accommodation for its thousands of workers are abandoned. Some people believe that the Duga woodpecker was not a victim, but the cause of the disaster.
The woodpecker sums up brilliantly the Cold War generally. Advancements in technology and engineering that couldn't go fast enough at the time, built big on a huge scale, intimidating. And now it sits quietly, wasting away in the middle of an exclusion zone from Chernobyl. And maybe that's the image that we're left with when we look up at the woodpecker.
Today, the once mighty woodpecker stands isolated in the Ukrainian forests near the border with Russia. A decaying reminder of our fears of all-out war, too expensive to demolish and impossible to reuse. Just 700 miles away, in Germany, the remains of one of the Second World War's most sinister secrets still stands on the Baltic island of Rügen. Hidden behind the pine trees lining the coast is a giant building complex, so mortifying it makes one's blood run cold. Originally hailed for its futuristic design, it was constructed to be imposing. It has 6 stories, over 10,000 rooms, and can hold over 20,000 people. At 2.8 miles in length, it's one of the longest buildings ever constructed in Europe and dominates the surrounding scenery. But what was this structure's real sinister purpose? And why was it abandoned? In 1936, Hitler has his eyes set on taking over Europe. But to do that, he needs soldiers, and lots of them. His solution is to construct the biggest brainwashing domain in the world, the Prora complex.
This is nothing but a modern-day mind control center. This is where German workers would go for an alleged holiday. But guess what? You're being woken up with a loudspeaker and told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. You're going to have your meals together, and in your so-called leisure time, you're going to watch the same propaganda films and read the same propaganda literature.
The amount of time and money that went into creating the complex, you realize what an actually vitally important project it was for the Nazis. This was really the long-term game, which was to create a master race that thought like the Nazis thought.
It's not just the planned Nazi master race that was going to conquer the world. At the time, the mechanics and architecture of the Prora complex itself are state-of-the-art and form a physical example of cutting-edge engineering, construction, and design.
The concept was way ahead of its time in terms of what they were intending to produce. Yes, it was quite Spartan, but at the same time, you had this amazing complex that, of course, had an element of control planned or built into it. But for the average German worker, this would have seemed like nirvana. They would have come from industrial cities. They probably had never seen the sea before. So you can understand its attraction.
You have to imagine the whole intent was to make the holidaymakers step off that boat and say, wow, this is fantastic. There must have been a great deal of nationalism.
But how would the Nazis indoctrinate those who went there? And why was Prora abandoned? On the edge of Second World War, it is one of the most top-secret projects for the Nazis. A place where thousands of German citizens were to become indoctrinated into the ideology of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Katja Luca is a local historian who's an expert on the site.
People were to be manipulated and influenced here. The idea behind that was that people were to get maximum rest and recovery without having a single moment of spare time, to get fit and strong for the war, to achieve better work results, and actually also to be conditioned for mass murder. You could say that this is the Nazi ideology. We can actually see the notion of how the Nazis envisioned the people's community to be. There would have been an all-day programme, starting with a morning assembly, followed by swimming in the sea, dinner and a closing ceremony. Everything would have been elaborately organised.
But the Prora complex is also a masterpiece of design and engineering. The 2.8-mile-long building is divided into 8 6-story accommodation blocks, all constructed from reinforced concrete, a huge innovation at the time.
It would have been something that you'd never have seen before. And so with that comes that impression of, wow, this is cutting-edge technology. This is advancement. We're at the forefront here. So it might sound quite dull to us today, reinforced concrete. Back then, it was really exciting.
Each block contains dozens of rooms overlooking the sea, all designed to be deliberately basic. Prora wasn't about luxury, it was about power. Its huge entrance halls are designed to have the same impact as the vast Nuremberg rally arena.
This room is part of the reception hall. It was built tall and mighty to impress the workers who would have come here. It was one way of having a great influence. If you came here, you would have felt intimidated, but at the same time, also uplifted by being part of such a great idea. This is how manipulation worked.
You look at Prora today, and it's sort of desolate. It doesn't have the grandeur that it was intended to have, and probably once did. If you look at some of the original designs, this has this great Aryan feel to it. You can imagine coming off the boat and saying, wow, what a great country is this?
Don't think you could see a structure back then in the 1930s like what there is at Prora and not be impressed by it, not feel as though, wow, this is something special and it's ours.
But what role did Prora play in Hitler's plans for world domination and genocide? And why was Prora finally abandoned? In 1936, the Nazi architect's plans for the key part of the Prora complex is a monumental auditorium capable of holding all 20,000 German laborers at the same time.
It's austere. It is everything that is grand about the so-called Aryan race, and it was designed to emit feelings of national pride, and you have to believe it had that very effect.
I think maybe you would be almost hypnotized by the sight that you've got in front of you. And maybe, yeah, the psychological effect of that worked to Hitler's hand.
But how could this site play a part in Hitler's plans for world domination and genocide? The ideological concept starts with an organization called Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy. Led by top Nazi Robert Ley, on the surface, Strength Through Joy just provides subsidized brakes for millions of low-paid German industrial workers. But its real mission is to unite them behind Hitler.
I think the Strength Through Joy organization had a very serious intention behind it, and that was to bind people to the Nazi regime. And probably even more than that, there was an attempt to brainwash people and prepare them for the possibility of war.
Propaganda was totally essential to the success of the Third Reich. They had to have everyone on board. So what Prora was an ideological way of making people feel really happy about giving 100% of their free time being indoctrinated with, aren't we the greatest? Isn't it worth the suffer? Shouldn't we all be in this together?
But in 1939, Hitler invades Poland and sets off World War II. And with that, the engineering of Prora is abandoned.
It is one of the greatest building legacies of the Nazis. And although the building never functioned like they planned it would, you can begin to understand what it was meant to be used for and understand their ideology.
At the end of the war, Prora is taken over by the invading Russian forces, who turn it into a military prison for those who oppose the communist regime. And when the Berlin Wall falls in the 1990s, Prora is finally abandoned.
Many believe the whole complex should have been leveled. Let's forget about this mind control program. It's a part of our dark past. Let's keep it there.
Now, the Prora complex is a powerful reminder of Hitler's ruthless ambition to totally dominate the thoughts and actions of his own people. Thankfully, the site never went into full operation before the Second World War ended. But today, in a strange twist, the Prora complex is being turned into luxury seaside apartments, complete with luxury designer furniture and balconies overlooking the Baltic Sea. In the neighboring country of France, deep inside the bleak and rocky alpine mountains above Grenoble, is an amazing engineering feat carved out of the solid rock of a cliff face. It's a road that extends for over 20 miles, goes through 30 tunnels, and sits nearly 1,000 feet above the Rhone River.
It's kind of man meets nature in this beautiful way. And it's something that you won't see anywhere else. It's totally unique.
It is incredibly dangerous, and I can't imagine for a second that anyone would be able to do that today, because you've got outcrops, valleys, rivers, changing the course of what the mountains actually look like.
Building around mountain passes and tunnels is a real challenge and a real difficulty.
But what led to the construction of this treacherous road, and why was it abandoned? In 1848, French farmers need a connection from the Vercors Plateau to the cities in the valley below. The French government decide to engineer a road through the sides of vertical cliffs. Their solution, the Grand Goulet, meaning the great bottlenecks. The obstacles are immense. Surrounded by granite cliffs and sheer-sided gorges, the Vercors Valley is a natural fortress. Finding a way through its defenses is no easy task.
Of course, at the time, it was really impossible. It was really the construction of the century for the region.
What seemingly insurmountable obstacles did the builders face, and why was the road abandoned? The Grand Goulet, or the Great Bottlenecks, is one of the most dangerous mountain routes in the world. It snakes its way thousands of feet above the Rhone River in southern France, linking the remote mountain communities with the towns below. What obstacles did the workers and engineers face? And just how did they overcome them?
The start of the Grand Goulet Road follows a part of a natural erosion where a river had previously gone through. Now, water will always take the path of least resistance. So maybe following nature in its way of tunneling and eroding, creating its own passage, is a good idea. But then you also have to think about, well, hang on, if this is the path of least resistance, what is the geology that I've got around us here? So it's a tricky one to know whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do.
In 1846, engineering begins by cutting a tunnel alongside the river. But after a few hundred yards, it abruptly changes course and drops to the bottom of the gorge. Now, the engineers face another huge challenge. They have to cut a working road into the vertical cliff face ahead.
You've got rock above you and down one side, but then you've still got that sheer drop. It's like an open-sided tunnel. But that's the challenges they were faced when they were building it. It wasn't just all of one thing. It's all open road, it's all tunneling. They were having to continuously change and build the road to go along with what nature had put there in front of them. And maybe it's a bit disconcerting when you go into those kind of half tunnels, because you're immediately aware that you have an enormous tonnage of rock right above you, and yet on one side there's no support. There's just a sheer drop.
The engineers develop a technique that seems suicidal. Workers drop down the cliff face on ropes, chisel a hole for the explosive charge, light the fuse, then swing out of the way while it goes off. It's extremely dangerous work.
Would they have any better ways of doing it? At the time, really hard to say. They probably could have done it manually with picks and axes. And of course, that would have taken much, much longer to do. So I guess they chose the more risky but quick option to build this road.
The construction methods used to build the Grand Goulet Road would have a health and safety officer today in a cold sweat. Every single day when these guys went to work, there was a huge risk they might not come back.
It takes 6 years of backbreaking work and thousands of tons of dynamite to complete the crucial 2-mile-long stretch of the Grand Goulet. Dozens of workers die in what becomes a monumental engineering effort. But in 1851, the new road changes life dramatically for the villagers on the Vercors Plateau. Its breathtaking views and easy access from the valleys below make it one of the most popular destinations in southern France.
The Grand Goulet set out to be a commercial road from the get-go, connecting villages in the mountain to the rest of the world. But as soon as it was constructed, as soon as men finished risking their lives by hanging on with one hand and doing explosives with the other just to go 10 meters further, it was something special. It was romantic, it was inspiring, and people were obsessed about traveling on it.
I'm not sure the engineers involved in building the Grand Goulet Road knew that they were creating a kind of artistic and cultural masterpiece at the time. But when you look back on it, now it is something of beauty. There is something of kind of mystique. It has a huge artistic value to it. And I think that's one of the beauties of engineering.
But problems soon start for the Grand Goulet. Constructed just wide enough for 2 horse-drawn wagons to pass each other, by the early 20th century, it has trouble coping with modern transportation like cars, buses, and trucks. When the engineers try to widen it, they discover a crucial mistake.
The Grand Goulet Road is quite narrow, and there's good reason for that. There's no reinforcement in the tunnels or in the kind of open tunnels that you go through as you make your way along the side of the mountain. And so you're limited to how wide you can take the road because you're not reinforcing the rock above you.
To widen it, that would have been really challenging. They would have had to really think about, well, how do we support this rock? And that can be very, very difficult, especially at the time with trying to transport material there to create frames to maybe hold the rock face up. You're then almost coming into that tunneling type of territory, which maybe at the time was just a little bit beyond what they were trying to actually achieve.
As the years go by, faster, bigger cars turn the road's tight curves into death traps. Then in 2000, and again in 2005, nature itself plays its hand. Whole sections of cliff fall down onto the road. After 150 years, in 2005, the French authorities closed the road. Today, the Grand Goulet is abandoned, but its legacy in French engineering lives on.
The Grand Goulet is closed today, and understandably so. It's dangerous. The question is, what do we do about that? Do we go in and bulldoze a wider road and put up ropes so it's safe and everyone can go experience it? Or do we let this perfect moment in time, this romantic journey and the memory of it, the photographs of it, do we let it live on as is? I think we do.